The discovery did not feel like a discovery. That is the first honest thing to say about it, and also the thing that makes it difficult to explain in the way that discoveries are usually explained. The usual discovery has a before and an after with a visible line between them, a moment. A specific piece of information received in a specific moment that reorganizes everything on either side of the receiving. The before version looking different in the retrospective light. The after version feeling like the correct orientation, the one that the before version was moving toward without knowing it was moving toward anything. This was not that. This was the other kind, the kind that arrives so quietly and so incrementally and so thoroughly without the atmosphere of the significant moment that you do not know it has arrived until you are already inside it. Until the reorganization has been underway for long enough that the original arrangement is no longer accessible as the felt experience, is only accessible as the intellectual memory of how things used to look. And the intellectual memory is not the same as the felt experience. You can remember the old perspective without being able to inhabit it, without being able to feel from inside it the way it felt to be in it before the discovery changed what you were seeing. The perspective is gone. What replaced it is so thoroughly present that the old one exists only as the description of a place you have left. I want to start with what I thought I knew. No, but I was wrong about. That framing puts the emphasis on the error, and the error is not the interesting part. The interesting part is the specific quality of certainty I had. The specific settled feels like the floor quality of the understanding I was operating from, before the discovery showed me it was a ceiling. I thought I knew what she was, not who. What? The category, the organized understanding of the type of person she was that I had assembled from the available evidence and that I was using without examining the using of it. To predict and interpret and make sense of everything that arrived from her direction. The assembled understanding was coherent. That is the specific problem with the wrong perspective that is nevertheless internally consistent. It explains things, it makes the evidence make sense, it produces predictions that are confirmed often enough to sustain the confidence in the framework. The framework is wrong, and it works, and the working of it is what prevents the examination that would reveal the wrongness. I had a working framework for her. The framework was wrong. Let me tell you how the framework was built. Not through a single conversation or single observation, through the specific, accumulated, completely unintentional process of someone who is receiving information about another person and organizing it into the available categories before the information has had time to resist the organization. The available categories are the problem. They are the categories I arrive with. The pre-existing shapes that the mind offers as containers for new information, because the mind prefers the organized to the unorganized and will impose organization on incoming information rather than leave the information uncontained until its own shape becomes clear. The categories are real, are based on actual experience of actual people, are useful in the general sense of allowing you to navigate the world without having to build the understanding of every person from absolute zero. They are useless in the specific sense, because the specific person is never the category, is always more than the category. Is the category plus the specific deviation from it that makes them themselves. And the deviation is the important part, the deviation is the person, the category is just a starting approximation. The scaffold that should be replaced as the actual person reveals themselves to be more specific than the scaffold can hold. I had not replaced the scaffold, I had been building my understanding of her on the scaffold rather than on the person, not deliberately, not from the laziness of someone who has decided the scaffold is sufficient and is not interested in more. From the specific, comfortable, completely natural momentum of the understanding that was working, that was producing a coherent picture, that was allowing me to predict and interpret and make sense of things. The working framework is self-perpetuating in this specific way of all working things. You do not fix what is not broken. You do not examine the instrument when the instrument is producing results. The instrument was producing results. The results were wrong. There is a specific moment when the framework started to fail. Not when it collapsed. The collapse came later, all at once, in the specific way that the things which have been wrong for a long time eventually give. First, the slow accumulation of the evidence that does not fit, then the threshold, then the giving. The specific moment when the framework started to fail was smaller than the collapse. It was a single thing she did that the framework could not explain, not a dramatic thing, not the category-defining action that announces itself as the challenge to the existing understanding, the quiet thing. the unremarkable thing. The thing that would have passed entirely beneath the radar of someone who is not already at some barely conscious level beginning to feel the gap between what the framework predicted and what the person was actually producing. I was beginning to feel the gap, and this thing she did, small, specific, not organized from my observation, widened the gap past the point where the framework could paper over it. She was in a situation where the person I had her categorized as would have behaved in a specific, predictable, entirely consistent with the framework way. I knew what was coming. Had the prediction fully formed, was waiting for the confirmation that the framework was reliable. She did something else entirely, not the dramatic opposite, not the category-shattering deviation that reorganizes everything in a single moment. The quiet, specific, this is not what the scaffold predicts thing. The behavior of a person had different interior contents than the scaffold had assumed. The scaffold assumed one interior. The behavior was reporting a different one. I sat with that for longer than felt necessary at the time. The sitting was not a decision. It was a specific, involuntary response of someone whose instrument has produced a result that contradicts the expected output. The instrument does not immediately revise its own calibration. It holds the contradictory result and examines it for the error, looks for the alternative explanation that is consistent with the current calibration, tries to find the reading of the evidence that does not require the framework to be wrong. I tried. The contradictory result did not resolve into the framework consistent reading, so I held both things, the framework and the thing that did not fit it. I held them in the specific, uncomfortable, something has to give position of someone who has been presented with evidence that is in genuine tension with the existing understanding and who has not yet decided which one to revise, the evidence or the framework. One of them was wrong. I want to say something about the instinct at this point. The instinct that the evidence is wrong, it is the more comfortable conclusion. The framework has been in place longer, has more confirmation behind it, has the specific accumulated weight of the understanding that has been built on it. Revising the evidence, finding the alternative reading, the exception that proves the rule interpretation, the way of looking at the contradictory thing that allows it to be consistent with the existing picture, is the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance is the path most taken. I know this because I have taken it. Not in this specific case. This specific case is where I stopped taking it, which is why the discovery happened. But in other cases, with other people, with the evidence that arrived in contradiction of the framework I was holding and that I revised rather than the framework, that I squeezed into the available shape rather than letting it keep its own shape and revising the available shape around it. The squeezed version of the evidence is always a little raw. And the little wrongness compounds. Each subsequent piece of evidence either confirms the framework or is squeezed to fit it. The framework never fails because the framework is never genuinely tested. The testing is always a little rigged. The evidence that would break the framework is always given the alternative reading that preserves it. The person you are categorizing becomes the category because you are not letting them be themselves. You are letting them be the version of themselves that is consistent with what you already think. I stopped doing that with her somewhere in the holding of the contradictory result, not with the explicit decision, with the exhaustion of the squeezing. This specific, quiet exhaustion of a person who has been holding two incompatible things and has been trying to make them compatible and has finally stopped trying, not from the giving up, from the understanding that the trying is the problem, that the effort to make the evidence consistent with the framework is the effort that is preventing the seeing. I put the framework down, not permanently, not for all purposes. I am not describing the abandonment of the categorizing mind, which is not possible and not desirable, for the specific purpose of seeing her. I put down the assembled understanding of what she was and sat with the direct evidence of who she was without the organizing structure between the evidence and the receiving. The direct evidence was different, not in all the facts. Many of the facts were the same. But the meaning of the facts changed without the framework filtering the meaning. The things I had been reading as confirmation of the category were, without the category, reading as something else entirely. As the specific, particular, this person specifically, expressions of an interior that was more complicated and more interesting and more genuinely itself than the category had been able to accommodate. The category had been too small. I had been holding her in a container she had been exceeding from the beginning, and I had been managing the excess, quietly, automatically, without examining the managing. rather than expanding the container. What I found when I put the framework down. The first thing was the fear, not hers, mine. The specific located, now I can see where it lies, fear that had been generating the framework. Because the framework is not neutral. The framework is not just the innocent organizing function of the categorizing mind. In this case, in the specific case of a person whose category I had assembled early and maintained carefully, the framework had been doing something else. Something I had not examined. The framework had been protecting me from the full version of her. The full version of her was more than the category, was more than I had allowed her to be. And the moreness was the specific, particular kind of more that the person who had built that framework was not yet ready to encounter. Too much realness, too much specificity, too much of the quality of presence that the full version of a person produces when you are receiving them without the filter. The filter had been protection. I had not known that. Had thought the framework was just the understanding. The neutral, organized helps you navigate understanding. It was that. And it was also the management of the exposure, the management of how much of the actual person was allowed to arrive. Putting down the framework meant putting down the protection. The full version arrived. The full version of her is what I want to try to describe. Not fully, the full version of a person does not fit into the description, and the attempt to fit it always produces the reduction I have been trying to avoid. But the quality of it, the thing that the category had been too small to hold. She carries things without putting them down on other people. I want to say this carefully because it is easy to make this sound like the stoic performance of someone who has decided not to burden others. Not the performed self-sufficiency of someone who is managing the impression of strength. The actual version. The version that comes from having developed through the specific and not easy process of a life that has required it. The genuine capacity to hold difficult things without requiring the external to absorb the weight of them. She holds her own weight. Not because she is closed. The closed version of this is its own problem. The self-containment that becomes the wall. The not burdening that becomes the not letting in. She is not closed. She is available in a specific, open, genuinely interested way of someone who has learned that there is a difference between receiving the weight of other people's things and being crushed by it. She can receive. She receives fully. She gives that to other people, and she does not then require the same in return in the transactional sense. The framework had read this as the absence of need. The actual reading is the presence of capacity. These are not the same thing, and reading them as the same thing had produced the specific, significant error of treating her as someone who did not require the particular quality of attention and care that the person with need requires, who was fine, who was handling it, who did not need the checking in or the sitting with or the specific attentive presence of someone who's genuinely paying attention to whether the other person is actually fine or is fine in the performing fine sense. She was often performing fine. I had been accepting the performance as the fact. The second thing I found when the framework came down, the intelligence, not the kind I had already registered, that was in the category, was part of the assembled understanding, the other kind, the kind that does not announce itself, that operates below the level of the displayable, that is present in the quality of the questions she asks, rather than in the conclusions she reaches. In the specific, unhurried, genuine, curious way she approaches things she does not understand. Not to resolve the not understanding into the understanding quickly, but to stay in the not understanding long enough to find out what it actually contains. The framework had her intelligence in the category where it was impressive. The reality had it in the category where it was interesting. Impressive and interesting are not the same category. Impressive intelligence performs, produces the output that demonstrates the capacity, is organized at least partially around the reception of the demonstration. Interesting intelligence does not perform, is organized around the thing it is engaged with rather than around the response of the audience, loses itself in the question, forgets to check whether the question is making the right impression. Her intelligence loses itself in the question. I had not been close enough to the actual thing to see this. Had been receiving the impressive register, the parts of her thinking that arrived in a displayable form, and had filed them in the impressive category. Had missed the underneath, the quiet, unannounced, happening when nobody is watching intelligence that was the actual source of what the framework had been registering as the impressive outputs. The source is more interesting than the outputs. It always is. The third thing, this one is the hardest to say because it requires me to say something about myself that the accounting of the discovery would prefer to leave out. but the full accounting requires it. The framework had been keeping her at the distance where I was comfortable. Not physically, in the sense of the specific interior distance between the real contact and the managed contact. The managed contact is a contact that does not require you to be changed by what you receive. You receive it, you process it through the framework, you file it in the category, you respond appropriately, and you remain essentially unchanged. The framework is the thing that allows the remaining unchanged. That converts the genuine encounter into the managed one. That allows you to be in proximity to another person without the full version of that person actually arriving. The full version of the person, when it arrives without the filter, changes you. I had been avoiding the changing, not consciously, in the specific, entirely automatic way of someone who has found the position of the managed contact comfortable and has not examined whether the comfort is the right criterion. The comfort was the criterion. The framework maintained the comfort. The framework was doing its job, and the job was wrong. Here is what the change perspective actually means, not the abstract version. The daily, specific, in-the-room version. What is different in the actual encounter with her now that the framework is down? The first thing that is different is the hearing. I hear more what she is actually saying, not the content. The content was available before, the underneath, the thing the content is about. The soft, quiet, not always directly stated thing that the words are pointing toward rather than containing. The framework had been receiving the words and organizing them into the framework consistent meaning. The actual hearing receives the words and follows them to where they are pointing. She points to things she does not name directly. The framework was missing everything she was pointing at. The pointing is where the real communication lives. The second thing that is different is the presence I bring. The managed contact had a specific quality of presence. Adequate. Appropriate, functioning. The presence is someone who is in the room and attending to the room and responding to what the room produces in the calibrated, competent way of someone who knows how to be in a room. The actual contact requires the different presence. The presence that does not know what is coming, that cannot predict the next thing from the framework because the framework is down, that has to actually be here in the actual moment receiving the actual person with no organized expectation of what the receiving is going to produce. The uncertainty of the actual contact is what the managed contact was protecting against. I have been protected from her. I'm not protected anymore. The not protection is the best thing. I am going to tell you what triggered the final collapse of the framework. The threshold moment, the one where the accumulated evidence finally reached the point that the framework could not survive. She said something in a conversation that was not about us. That was about something else entirely. A situation involving someone neither of us knew well, a difficulty someone was in. And what she said about it, the specific, unguarded, not organized for my reception thing she said, was the most accurate reading of that situation I had ever heard from anyone. Not accurate in the impressive sense, in the quiet sense. In the here is the thing everyone else has been circling since. The direct path to the actual truth of the situation. Walked simply and without drama. She did not know she had said it. Had moved on from it before I had fully received it. But I had received it. And in the receiving, I understood that the person I had been holding in the framework had been producing observations like that one consistently, in the quiet register for the entire time I had known her. I had been filing them under impressive. They were not impressive. They were true. And the person who consistently, quietly, without the performance, produces the true thing is not the category I had her in, is not any category I had her in, is not any category, is the specific, irreplaceable, cannot be organized into the available shapes thing that is an actual person actually seen. That is who she is. That is who she has been the whole time. The perspective did not change what she was. It changed what I was able to see. The change was complete, and it was entirely mine to account for. Not immediately after the framework came down. The framework coming down was mine, my interior event, my private reorganization. It did not belong to her until I gave it to her. And the giving required this specific, careful preparation of someone who understands that saying, I have been seeing you wrong, is not a simple thing to receive. That it carries the weight of the years of the wrong seeing. That the person receiving it has to hold both things simultaneously. The acknowledgement that they were not being fully seen and the offering of the fuller seeing now. I waited until I could give her both things at once. The conversation was on a Sunday afternoon, nothing around it, no occasion. This specific, ordinary quality of a day that had no ambitions and that I had chosen deliberately because the occasion creates the performance and is needed to be without the performance. I said, I've been holding you in a framework that was too small for you for a long time. I want to tell you what I actually see now that it's done. She was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet, the receiving quiet. The specific quality of someone who has been waiting without knowing they were waiting for a particular thing and has just heard it arrive. I said what I saw. Not all of it. The full accounting would have been too much for a single conversation, and she deserved the space to receive each part before the next arrived. But the central things, the carrying without putting down, the intelligence that loses itself in the question, the pointing at things she does not name, the performing fine that I had been accepting as the fact. When I said the last one, she looked at me differently, not with the gratitude that would have made the moment sentimental, with the specific, clear-eyed quality of someone who has just been seen in a place they had assumed was invisible. She said, "How long have you known about that one?" I said, "Not long enough, too recently." She did not say it was fine. She was freshly honest, and it was not entirely fine, and she did not dress it as something it was not. She said, "But you see it now." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you're not going to file it under fine." I said, "No." What changed after that conversation was not dramatic. The dramatic change had already happened. Internally, in the private reorganization of the seeing, the conversation was not the change. It was the giving of the change to her. The making of it mutual. The transformation from my private new perspective into the shared ground we were now both standing on. The shared ground is different from the private ground. The private seeing is still the managed version. The said seeing is the actual thing. I had seen her, I had seen her, I had said the seeing, she had received it. The framework is not coming back, neither is the distance it was keeping.